So welcome yet again to another lecture on market failure, and this time we'll be talking about the concept of externalities. So let's look at the definition of what an externality actually is. So externalities are costs or benefits that arise from the consumption or production of goods and services passed onto a third party. And what a third party means is that someone not directly involved in the initial transaction. So not directly involved in the initial market transaction. So for example, you have a smoker and you have a 7-Eleven. So the smoker buys the packet of smokes from 7-Eleven, and that's the initial transaction. So the smoker gives the money to the 7-Eleven person, the owner, and the owner gives the smoker his packet of cigarettes. So, and when the consumption of the cigarettes takes place, there will be a cost to a third party who happens to be in the vicinity of the smoker and therefore consume second-hand smoke. That's a negative externality. So as we can see, externalities can be positive or they can be negative. Let's put this in red so that we know it is bad. So negative, which are costs, and positive, which are benefits. So for example, positive externality may be vaccinations. So what this means is when someone gets vaccinated from a certain disease, so say the flu, then they are immune from, say, the flu in that season, and therefore people who come across him or her will therefore be immune as well from catching the flu from that person who got vaccinated. So that's a positive externality. Again, another example is when you paint your house. It's going to look pretty, and people who pass by or neighbors will feel that they're living in a very safe and very welcoming street, and so therefore you're passing on another benefit from consuming or painting your house, which is a service. And that's going to pass on benefits to a third party, which may be your neighbors. And so negative externalities refer to, say, examples of consuming secondhand smoke. So that is a bad thing because you don't want to get cancer or you don't want to get sick from consuming someone else's smoke. And also you have the idea of pollution. So when we consume things, or when we drive our cars, even though we're actually deriving some benefit because we're traveling a lot faster from point A to point B, we're actually polluting the environment and therefore making the livelihoods worse of people who aren't actually directly involved in the initial transaction. And so we can see that negative externalities can be positive or can be negative. So now let's look at the different types of graphs involved with negative externalities. We can rub this out now. So we know that negative externalities can be positive or negative. So the most common type of externality is actually negative externalities, which is a pity, but that's the way the world works. We have an upward sloping supply curve. This is fairly straightforward and fairly rudimentary, that we're talking about an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. We also have the equilibrium quantity traded at P1 equivalent to Q1. So the market's at equilibrium, and let's say this is the market for cigarettes. But however, we have to note that the quantity traded, or the optimal quantity traded, is actually at Q2. This relates to the optimal quantity traded, and this is the social optimum, where the government and society believes that if Q2 amount of cigarettes are smoked, therefore the overall benefit of society would actually be maximized. So what happens is, to trade at Q2 we need a price, or we need a demand of, say, here. But we know that demand for cigarettes is at Q1. So we need to somehow increase the price of cigarettes from P1, let's make that arrow more clear, to P2. But as we know, if the price of a cigarette is at P2, then therefore the quantity supply would in fact be here, because producers are seeing greater profit opportunities, and therefore they will produce at Q3. And that's not good for the people, because we want it at Q2. That's what we want it at. So what the government can do is they could tax producers. And tax means that the producers only are able to get or receive price at P3. So they only, when they sell the product at P2, they get taxed P2 minus P3. So let's assume that P2 is in fact $15 and P3 is in fact $5. So they're in fact selling the cigarette at $15, but the government demands a $10 indirect tax from the sales of cigarettes. And so by that token we have a profit of only, or revenue of only $5 by suppliers, or by businesses. And that means because the profit is only at $5, and therefore they have less incentives to supply, and therefore they will contract supply from Q1 to Q2. And similarly, because they're still selling at $15, but they only get $5 revenue, because they're still selling at $15, demand will be at this point at Q1. And so that's how the government can contract supply and as well as contract demand, so that they reach a social optimum at Q2 and eliminate the externalities, or the negative externalities, involved with consuming cigarettes. Okay, let's look at the converse. Let's look at the situation where we have a positive externality. So let's look at this concept of vaccines. Let's say it costs a lot of money to get yourself vaccinated, and therefore people are just going to take the risk, like I do, and risk we're not going to get infected by a flu over the winter period. So we have supply of vaccines, which is upward sloping, and a demand which is downward sloping. And now we know that the equilibrium quantity without any government intervention is at Q1 and P1. But what the government wants is they want everyone to be vaccinated, and so the actual social optimum is at Q2. So this is the social optimum. They want the production to be at Q2. But at Q2 you can see that demand will only be at Q2 if it corresponds to this price at P2. And similarly, price, or the supply, would only be at Q2 if the price of vaccines would be at P3. So businesses who supply vaccines, they're not going to be willing to supply vaccines at Q2 quantities if the price is only at P2. Let's just assume that this is $5 again, the equilibrium price is $10, and P3 is $15. So they're only going to supply Q2 amount of vaccines if the price is $15. And so what the government does is they're going to subsidize the firm. So they're going to say, okay, you're going to charge a market price of only $5, and we're going to give you $10 for every unit of vaccines you're going to sell. And so you're still making $15 worth of revenue. And so this corresponds to this point here. And so what this means is that buyers are only buying at $5, which corresponds to here. And since the cost of the vaccine is only $5, therefore the supply, the quantity demanded would be at Q2. And this correlates to the social optimum. Now, as you can see, the government can combat this idea of positive externalities, where there is an underconsumption of this good or this service by subsidizing the service or good, and therefore increase the quantity traded to Q2, which is again the social optimal amount. So to recap, externalities are costs or benefits that arise from the consumption or production of goods and services passed on to a third party, so a party that is not directly involved in the initial market transaction. So externalities can be positive in the form of vaccines, or in the form when you paint your house, or they can be mostly negative, which relates back to the idea of pollution and other costs. So secondhand smoke was the other example that we came up with. So that is what externalities is all about. It's about how governments can use subsidies or use taxes to help the market readjust and produce at the social optimum amount, even though the operations of the free market will not produce that amount. And so that is a market failure for the operation of the free market, because the social optimum is not produced in the operation of the free market.